Welcome to the TCG Compass Podcast, presented by Amber Grading, a mostly weekly discussion on trading card games and the people who love them.
How's it going, everybody? I am your host, Daniel, and I'm joined today with my co-host, Grant.
Hi there.
Today's show, we're going to be talking about learning to play TCG games.
Yeah, like Digimon, Final Fantasy, and some older ones like Lightseekers, Force of Will, Magi Nation, and so on.
Exactly. So, I imagine that a lot of our listeners and viewers play games like Final Fantasy, Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, but there's actually tons of other TCGs out there that are a lot of fun, and with a not even a really like in-depth basis for TCGs. Learning these other games is actually fairly simple and can be a lot of fun. But Grant, outside of like the major staples like Magic and Pokemon, have you ever played any other TCG games?
So I dabbled in the World of Warcraft TCG, and now it's kind of like defunct, I think, as of like 2013 or 2016. That was kind of the main one. I thought the gameplay was actually pretty good. I think it also kind of like rose and fell with the actual like computer game. That was like part of it. But I've also been like checking out like things like Yu-Gi-Oh! I have some friends that are pretty deep into it. They like the one-turn kills or the first-turn kills in that game. And, also things like MetaZoo and, and whenever I go to Japan, it's always kind of fun to look at all the card stores and like see their huge selection. Because especially in Japan, like people play so many different card games there. How about you?
They really do. I've been into a lot of different TCGs my entire life. But the big ones for me were, obviously Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, Final Fantasy TCG. I like really got into it with Opus 1. I just loved the art, and the gameplay was really fun. But like most recently, I've been learning a lot of new TCGs, just trying to dip my toes into every single game, even the ones that, like you said, are defunct, like World of Warcraft or Lightseekers, Magi Nation. Magi Nation in particular still has a huge cult following. And they're still great games. They're a lot of fun. They just didn't quite get the backing that they needed immediately. But now that we're seeing this huge revival of TCGs, across the world, Digimon is taking another crack at it. I know, like they had originally printed some cards. I think it was through Topps. Not quite sure if it was a game or not. It was more like collectible cards. But now with the Digimon TCG, it's actually doing really well. It started in Japan first, and then last year, I think 2021, they started releasing it in the United States with essentially it's called BT3, and then there was two different versions of BT3, which were basically a culmination of BT1, 2, and 3 from Japan. And we have this cool system here where Japan is perpetually 2 sets ahead of us. So like we get to see the meta and we get to see what the decks are going to, turn into. And then we get to speculate here in America as like, these decks are probably going to be really good here, but we don't know for sure because they might change the set slightly. There might be bannings, rules changes might occur. But at least here in Tucson, at one of my LGSs, they have 35 plus player tournaments every Tuesday for Digimon. And to me, that signals that game is gaining a lot of ground. But it also is a signal for, TCGs in general gaining strength. I know if anybody's been on Kickstarter lately, you might have noticed that there's been 2 games, Nostalgics and Grand Archive, which recently closed at near $1 million Kickstarters. That could just be people hoping to hit the next big thing, like, with MetaZoo, where MetaZoo Kickstarter cards are incredibly valuable. It could be that the games are actually going to be really awesome, which I think they will be. I'm backers on both of those games, and they both look like they're a lot of fun. But, it's interesting to see that people are expanding beyond, like, the big 2 being Pokemon and Magic, and actually, like, investing and playing in tournaments in these others. Did you ever get into like any of the other games that are now defunct, like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars TCG?
I have a little bit of Flesh and Blood, and I think that's like it's not defunct, obviously, but I think the World of Warcraft one was kind of the coolest. I like the interaction with having the card game itself, but also having the redemption cards that you can use in game to get different pets and mounts and stuff and loot. So I think like that aspect of it, and granted, some other games like Pokemon, right? They have like the code cards for their digital form of the game. I kind of like that. You can build collections in more than one place, and that's always been like a big draw for me. And to go touch on your point too, I think there's a lot of like real money in a lot of these games now. Like now that we see, the success or the price increases for Flesh and Blood First Editions, MetaZoo from the Kickstarter. There's just so many examples, even Final Fantasy, right? Like these games that they're testing the waters, and as long as they have even like medium stickiness years later, like the value of those first printings just go through the roof. And so yeah, there's some people gambling on it, but I also think that there's like a lot of people who are just like, hey, we've seen the board game market go absolutely nuts, where like everybody is producing new board games with all kinds of different themes and sets and industries and build outs and everything. And Kickstarter is really like helping be the platform to help popularize it and market it and get it into the hands of people. And for a lot of the projects, it's just like bringing them to life, right? Having no funding to like so much funding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a really great platform to let people know what's out there and give them, as much information as they could possibly want, and have direct access to the creators themselves, which is something that, back in the 90s, nobody had, because nobody even knew the game was being made, right? Yep. Something interesting I've recognized with Lightseekers, TCG, and Magi Nation, they both had 3 sets before they stopped getting printed. And I'm starting to wonder if maybe that's just a random number, or maybe that's like a signal. If a game doesn't make it past 3 sets, then maybe the game's not going anywhere. Or maybe 3 sets is the minimum that they think they have to get traction. And at that point, if they don't have the numbers they need, then they just stop printing it. But Lightseekers in particular, super fun game, and kind of like Pokemon, every card has like this pattern around the outside border where you could actually redeem the card for an online version, which is still live. So the game's still technically alive, it's just the paper printing is no longer available. But, when I was looking to find like games to start playing, and, like obviously Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a big one. But there's just so many games out there, some that are really popular and well known, and some that have gained traction, like Force of Will. And then there's some out there that are still like struggling to get by. Don't even know if they're still being printed or not, but they were printed recently. And they're fun, they're worth playing, but the biggest problem is like finding a group to play with, Mm-hmm. And that's why I think Digimon's going to be huge, because the fact the game's only been around for a year and it's got 35 players in a tournament at a local game store, I think that's like a really big sign that the game is going to take off, and it is a lot of fun. But I can't wait to get into MetaZoo. I have a whole bunch of MetaZoo decks I want to try out. But the other one too, like you mentioned, Flesh and Blood, it's taken the TCG world by storm. I think it's out of Australia or New Zealand. Awesome game. New Zealand, yeah. And the only problem is they were having like printing, issues where they couldn't print enough material because of the pandemic, and prices were going crazy. And obviously, in-person tournaments, which is the core of the game, were not happening the year the game got released or soon thereafter. So it's pretty interesting to see what's happening with all of these new games, and it'll be interesting to see how they turn out. Do you think that in America we'll go the way of Japan, where like people will actually start really engaging in more than one game at a time?
That's hard to say. Like, there's definitely, like, especially in Hawaii, right? There's stores like Toy Links where they host so many different games and tournaments there that there's definitely the opportunity for it. But I think some of these games are complex enough where, like, juggling 2 different games might be pretty hard. And I feel like in America, people have like their primary game and then everything else is secondary or tertiary. So, I don't think our culture here really rewards that, especially if you're doing the online and the in-person paper version of a particular game. And it's like the number, the fact that like our packs have more cards and stuff too, like you just have way more bulk. So I think at some point it just gets kind of unwieldy to like, go into a couple of different games.
Yep, and I agree. Managing one collection, especially for a game like Final Fantasy or Magic the Gathering, is a pretty huge task because there's a lot of sets, a lot of nuance, a lot of new printed material coming out. And then to try and do that times 2, or times 3 can be pretty overwhelming. For me in particular, I really love buying the precons because I don't have to learn how to build a deck. I don't have to know a lot about the game. I can just buy a couple of these little box sets and I can start playing. And it usually has like a watered down set of rules, and they almost always come with a play mat, so I know how to like set up the field, and it helps a lot. And the games that have done the best job of creating a how-to or a truly starter set are typically the ones that I end up playing. And the ones that are just like, well, here's some cards, figure it out. It's not, it hasn't really been that successful for me. I've played Flesh and Blood a few times, watched a lot of videos on it. I like to think of myself as a pretty advanced Magic the Gathering player. I've ranked top 100 in Limited on Arena, but like, some of the concepts, they're not really well explained in some of the material that they create. I've watched stuff by Tolarian Community College. I've watched official content, and I feel like the harder I have to work to figure out how a game works, the less I want to play it because I want the game to be intuitive. And if I have to teach somebody who's also going to struggle to learn how to play it, it just really makes it harder for the game to spread organically. But obviously, Flesh and Blood has done incredibly well, and it's a really fun game once you get it. But I found that it was a little bit more difficult than the average TCG, with like Pokemon, where it's super easy to pick up and play.
Which one of the newer games that you've learned how to play really appeals to you? Like, which one's just like easy to pick up and just start, going out the gate?
Digimon. I mean, all of the starting rules are on 3 cards, the same size as a normal card, and it's got some aspects of like Final Fantasy and Pokemon where it's got like your security cards off to the right, just like in Final Fantasy when, you've taken 7 damage, when you have no more security cards, and basically you take damage, you lose. It's got a lot of like Final Fantasy influences, a lot of Magic the Gathering influences. What I've learned now with like learning all of these games is that once you've learned like 3 or 4, you see a lot of the same aspects being reused, and it's like, oh, this is like that game, and this is like that game, and it's like I got it like real fast. So I learned UFS recently. I've had UFS cards for a long time because they made some Mega Man cards, and I'm obsessed with Mega Man. So I've been familiar with the game, but I never really got into how to play. But that game has a lot of like unique aspects to it, and like how you cast cards, and resource management is random, basically, that you have some control over. But it's like really fun game. My only problem is when games have a lot of luck involved, I believe it doesn't ruin, but it diminishes the competitive value of the game. It's like if I know that more than 50% of the game is determined by luck, then it kind of like removes that competitive edge that I feel like somebody who's like really good at the game might have. But if you haven't tried UFS, I strongly recommend it. It's super fun, and the fact that they can pull in different IPs from anywhere is super cool. So you have like Cowboy Bebop and Mega Man and Soul Calibur and like a Street Fighter. So like basically any IP that lets them, they'll make a UFS Ultimate Fighting System game based on their system, but using the IP of whatever it is they get. Right now, I think Cowboy Bebop's probably the most popular. And they also do a 10 set standard rotation, which means that your cards are good for a long time, which is pretty awesome. And I think that also helps with creating a healthy gameplay. So you don't like buy cards and they're immediately no good, like which occasionally happens in Magic.
Yeah, I wonder like what the future holds for a lot of these games in paper, right? I mean, if there's a digital version, I think there's always going to be opportunity because you can just like get it into more people's hands, especially because free to play with microtransactions has become, kind of the norm, right? So, it introduces people into the game first, and then if they want to like dive deeper, they can pay a couple of bucks here or there. And, now with like paper games like having a resurgence, like, who's going to be the winners at the end of the day? And, are people going to be taking like really good ideas from other games and implementing it in new games? Is there anything that you've seen that's like really unique to one of these new games that is unlike, any other concept in pre-existing games that we've played?
Yeah, well, like I said, UFS's resource system is it's basically random. So if you want to cast a card, you essentially flip over the top card of your deck, and it has a resource value on it. And if that resource value is the same or higher, then your card gets cast. And then every other card you cast on top of that, it then has like a tax. So your first card is just the raw cost, second card is +1, +2, and so on. And there's cards you can like remove cards from your stack, so that way the cards get cheaper. But you can also pay for it with essentially like lands that go to the bottom of your playmat. And so like you reveal, if it's not enough, you can like tap some of your resources. Okay. Essentially, it's not called tap in the game. But a lot of them have like overlapping values. What I really liked about Digimon over Pokemon is that you have a nursery, a hatchery, and then a nursery. So like you start with a pool of cards that are your Digimon that you can evolve onto or Digivolve onto. And so like no matter what's in your opening hand, because you can't mulligan in Digimon, you always have something that you can put out on the battlefield. Okay. Now, it can't attack, or it really can't do a lot while it's in that nursery, but you can at least Digivolve onto it, which allows you to draw another card, and you have something to like get you going, so you can keep, so you're not like out of the game just because you drew a bad hand. And what I found is that in every game I've played so far, there hasn't really been a need to mulligan, which means that they've kind of figured out this way to make consistent gameplay immediately, which is something no other game has done. So that was pretty cool. The one thing I don't like about Pokemon's mulligan rule is it almost feels like there's no downside. Like you can just keep going until you craft the perfect hand, and if that perfect hand allows you to win very quickly, then it almost doesn't matter what extra cards your opponent got. So I didn't like that. Digimon also has no maximum hand card size, but then it also like some cards benefit you for having like more than 7 or more than 8 cards. And their starter decks are awesome. They're really high quality. They're perfect for beginners, but you can mash a couple of them together and actually make a good deck. And there's really good content on YouTube being made for Digimon right off the bat. For a game that's so new, it has incredible support and a great community so far.
So did they have sets before when it was on TV and stuff, or is this like their first iteration of the trading card, or the card game?
So there was some Topps printed cards for Digimon, but I think that they were just collectible cards. I don't think that they were a game. I honestly don't know a lot about it. I had never gotten into Digimon. It was like one of those intellectual properties that just kind of eluded me up until very recently. So I wish I had more information on that, but I really don't. I just know that there are some older cards out there that don't look like playing cards that are pretty valuable.
Yeah, because when I was a kid, right, like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Digimon were all on TV kind of, in the same like block of time. And, obviously Pokemon TCG is out there, and Yu-Gi-Oh! So I was like, I wonder if they started something back then or not. And so I was like, okay. Because I know it was definitely like, it wasn't the S tier, like show to watch, right? Like if Pokemon was on, you would always watch that. And then Digimon was like somewhere in the middle, in terms of like Saturday morning cartoons, right?
Well, Digimon, I think people give a lot of crap for because they think it was like a ripoff of Pokemon, but I'm almost certain that Digimon came first. The only difference is that Pokemon kind of did it right in the way of like they made really cute characters, they had a really good cartoon, they had all these peripheria that like made it like really interesting. I mean, like I loved the original Game Boy game, the American version of the Game Boy game. Like, I absolutely loved it. I played it over and over and over again. Like, I have my original red copy up here. I still have my original level 100 Charizard on there, as long as my battery on it hasn't died. But like, I just absolutely love that game. And, they had a great system. They had, and they hit it out of the park with everything they did. I know Digimon made a lot of Game Boy games, but I don't think any of them were anywhere near as popular as the Pokemon games were. And I think that's ultimately what determined who the winner was going to be.
Yeah, it was kind of cool. Even back then, they made digital like Game Boy card games of the card game on Game Boy, and I was like,
yeah.
This is
they did that for Pokemon too.
Yeah, it's like this weird Inception thing where you're like, well, if you don't have Pokemon cards, you can play Pokemon on your Game Boy, and you're like, okay.
Yeah, it's a little weird. I actually have the strategy guide for the Pokemon version down there. It's pretty interesting, because you're looking at like 8-bit monocolor game, and it's like, how does this work? But they made it work. It wasn't good. But, it works. But yeah. But anyway, I think that's about all the time we have today. Grant, where can our viewers and listeners find you?
You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Chuggy_Bear.
And to get in touch with us, see the episode description or head over to ambergrading.com/TCG Compass. We'd love to hear from you.
That's our show for today. Thank you for joining us on the TCG Compass Podcast. I've been your co-host, Chuggy.
And I've been your host, Daniel. We'll see you next time.
This has been the TCG Compass Podcast, presented by Amber Grading. Thanks for listening. You can find us at ambergrading.com/TCG Compass, at Amber Grading on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, or drop us an email, tcgcompass@ambergrading.com.